Bacon. As you guys may or may not know, English philosopher, lived around 1500s, 1600s. So in English, what we would say 16th century, 17th century. Um, he's sort of like the first philosopher of science. Some might call him the first scientist. We'll see how true of a claim that is. Regardless, he is an interesting guy. Certainly more fundamentals of philosophy than who we covered last time, Peter Singer. More of a philosopher's philosopher. And as I think you could tell in the pre-reading, Russell, although has some reservations about him, overall, respects him. He thinks he's a pretty cool guy. All right. So, Francis Bacon was a philosopher entirely focused on the outside world. And by that, I mean both in terms of his philosophy was all based around gaining knowledge of the outside world, and the fact that he himself sort of lived his life focused on politics and power and money and whatever, which is sort of interesting because we haven't really encountered anyone so far who is that focused on it. Aquinas, to some extent, yeah, he achieved some political power in the church, but he wasn't that focused on it. Socrates was vehemently against it. Someone like Peter Singer in the modern tradition, all of our philosophers now are in universities. Francis Bacon, on the other hand, is someone who's continually messing around in politics, continually messing around in government, sometimes gets in a lot of trouble for it, but it does make him a rather interesting figure. In terms of his philosophy, again, it was very practical. He was not very concerned with ethics or, what is the true nature of things. The idea is, as Russell puts it, to give mankind mastery over the forces of nature by means of scientific discoveries and inventions. All right. And by the way, this is on the right, as you might guess, Francis Bacon, cutting a rather dashing figure. Pretty cool hat, pretty cool cape. So yeah, he's considered by many, including Voltaire, the French satirist and philosopher, to be the founder of the scientific method. And there's a quote by his biographer that I quite liked, which is this: Bacon's influence in the modern world is so great that every man who rides in a train, sends a telegram, follows a steam plow, sits in an easy chair, crosses the Channel or the Atlantic, eats a good dinner, enjoys a beautiful garden, or undergoes a painless surgical operation owes him something. So that might be overstated, but still it is, without Bacon's influence, without his ideas on the scientific method, science and technology in the world we take for granted today really wouldn't exist. So he is incredibly important in that sense. All right. So let's talk about the biography of one Sir Francis Bacon. So he was an aristocrat. He was born to wealthy, noble English family in 1561. So, and noble in this case is, literally a political category. It means his family was given by the crown certain political powers and privileges. So, he was born pretty well off. He studied at Cambridge, which at that point was just sort of a standard thing for a nobleman's son to do. And while he was there, Cambridge is, although this is post-English break from the Catholic Church, which you guys should know about with Henry VIII, still they're teaching all the same thing. They're teaching, Aristotle and Aquinas and all the same philosophy and whatever. So Francis Bacon gets a great education in it, and then he becomes disenchanted with it. He's like, this is not all it's cracked up to be. This isn't great, and specifically describes it as barren, which is an interesting word to use, right? Barren, like a woman who can't have children, or barren, like a piece of land that can't grow crops. He's saying nothing can grow out of Aristotelian philosophy. So, but anyways, after that, he goes into politics. He has a rough time of it at first. He has a rough time finding positions, and in order to finance his life and his ambitions, he keeps borrowing money from friends. So he is literally perpetually in debt. He actually goes to debtor's prison at one point, which, in England, you couldn't pay back your creditors. If you couldn't pay back people who lent you money, they could throw you in jail, which, as a historical note, is actually how the state of Georgia in America was founded. It was first founded as a debtor's prison. So if you couldn't pay back your money and people were really angry at you, they would send you all the way to America to work off your debts. So, and eventually he sort of turns it around. He ends up being pretty successful in politics. He served in Parliament, House of Lords. He's pretty liberal, liberal in terms of like economic policies, liberal in terms of social policies. He supports the Union of Ireland, Scotland, and England, which hasn't happened yet at this point. It's sort of ironic. While I was, writing this up, Brexit happened. So, in case you haven't seen the news, Britain has just exited the EU and caused all sorts of bad things to happen. Pound has crashed, stock market's in turmoil. No one's quite sure what the economy is going to look like a year from now, what the EU is going to look like a year from now. And we could probably assume that Francis Bacon, if he were alive today, would not have supported Brexit. But as this is not a politics class, I won't talk anymore about what a terrible idea Brexit is and was. Anyways, so Francis Bacon, convicted of corruption while being a judge during towards the end of his life. So he was convicted of taking bribes, and it's true, he took bribes. But as you learned in the pre-reading, pretty much everyone took bribes back then. It was just sort of one of the things he did as a judge. And his defense was, well, I never let it influence my opinions. I just took it as a friendly thing, which, it's, I guess, the morality of the time. Not sure if you can really say that's the greatest defense. The weirdest thing about his confession is he really could have just denied it, and he never would have gotten in trouble, and he never would have ended up in prison. And this is actually the Tower of London here, the famous British prison, and this is where he ended up for 40 months, I think, so a bit less than 4 years. And it also completely ruined his political career. So the question is, why would he confess? Why wouldn't he just deny it? The suspicion is that he was really blackmailed into confessing with evidence of sodomy, aka evidence of, loving men instead of loving women. And it's sort of strange. So that was always a crime in Britain, and that's been a crime in Britain up until, including the 20th century. But it's also always been an open secret in Britain. And we'll see several famous historical figures in England who sort of were pretty openly gay. They had, boyfriends who lived with them, and they, were sort of openly affectionate in public, including a few kings. And it was weird because on the one hand, they were openly gay, and on the other hand, being gay was a crime, and you could literally go to prison for it, or even worse. So British history is just filled with these very strange things of like someone is openly gay, and then they're accused in a court of being gay, and then all of a sudden they get thrown in prison. it's rather strange, and I wish I could sort of discuss it more because it's a rather weird sociological phenomenon. If any of you guys saw the recent movie about Alan Turing, the British computer scientist, I think it was called The Theory of Everything. No, it was called The Imitation Game. Alan Turing was another one who was gay, and everyone was okay with it until he was convicted of being gay and chemically castrated. So he, they put chemicals in him so he couldn't have children anymore. And then eventually he committed suicide because he was so distraught over it. It's very strange. It's a very strange sociological phenomenon. Also, the way Francis Bacon dies is very, very famous. So he was trying to observe refrigeration. So why is it that meat lasts longer when it's cold? So he stops his carriage one winter night and stuffs a chicken with snow, and then presumably puts it in a room to see how well it's preserved. While he's doing this, he catches cold, dies of pneumonia. So he dies in the service of science. And then lastly, this was a fact that I thought was somewhat interesting. So his assets at death were 13,000 pounds, and his debts at death were 23,000 pounds. So that's about 3 million in today's money, although it's really hard to convert. I think the impressive thing is that by the time he died, this includes the value of the land he had. By the time he died, his debts were literally almost twice his assets. He was a very talented philosopher, but he was not a good businessman. Okay. Next up, historical background. So you guys should know some of this from Gushu's class, maybe from your own knowledge. So this is after Henry VIII, right? So Henry VIII breaks off from the Catholic Church. His daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, tries to bring back the Catholic Church, fails, and then her sister, Elizabeth I, has a long and prosperous reign as the first Protestant Queen of England, and then James I comes as Mary's son, and he also rules England as a Protestant country, even though he is mostly Catholic. So it's a really interesting time to be alive and to be politically powerful like Francis Bacon was. It's this time of change, excitement, and uncertainty. So, by the way, in case you guys don't remember, Henry VIII was the one who made his country leave the Catholic Church because he wanted a divorce, because he kept trying to get a son. And these are his various marriages in an attempt to get a son. So first, Catherine of Aragon, Mary divorces her. Anne Boleyn tries to get a son. She fails. He executes her. Tries to get a son. She gets a son from her. She dies in childbirth. Again, another wife separates. Another wife executed. Finally, the last wife, Henry dies first. Henry VIII was not a great guy to be married to, even if he was the king. All right. So, historical background. Let's talk about the first half of Francis Bacon's adult life, or sort of life in politics, which was with Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. So she's the daughter of Henry VIII. She starts the English Protestant Church as an actual entity, as something competing against the Catholic Church, which is, of course, later called the Anglican Church. She's a virgin, and this means she never married. Doesn't mean that now, but that's what they meant then. And at first, it was sort of a scandal, and then eventually people celebrated her for it. During her lifetime, politics are sort of crazy. There's a lot of strife and turmoil on the continent. England has recently made itself a target by, divorcing itself from the Catholic Church. So there are a lot of plots on her life and a lot of attempts to sort of mess with England militarily. So she's rather cautious. Some historians say she's too cautious and she could have done more, but regardless, she does pretty well. Most famously, in 1588, she defeats the Spanish Armada, and she establishes English naval dominance. So for the next couple hundred years, England is the undisputed ruler of first the Atlantic and then all the oceans, which is how they managed to establish so many colonies and get trading rights and all that. And it's a great story, by the way. Long story short, England defeats the Spanish Armada with the help of a hurricane, of all things. And Bacon, maybe he's being genuine about this. Maybe he's just trying to become popular and win political favor. Writes this very popular piece about it in which he compares it to the Athenians defeating the Spartans. Remember, the Athenians were like Socrates, Aristotle, etc., like all of the educated Greeks. Spartans were the very militaristic, slave-owning Greeks. So you can see Bacon knows which side his bread is buttered on, to use an American expression. So the Elizabethan age we can describe as a time of trade, exploration, piracy. Francis Drake is her famous privateer who goes around and basically takes over other ships and robs them with her permission. And lastly, literature, because this is when Shakespeare starts. And it wasn't just Shakespeare. There were many plays, many dramatists during this time. Shakespeare is just the most well-known, especially in this day and age. All right, so additional historical background, we also get James I. So as I said, James I, he's the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. So that was Elizabeth's older sister, who was Catholic queen. Unlike Mary and Elizabeth, who have a very difficult relationship in which Mary actually puts Elizabeth in prison while she's a little girl, it's pretty peaceable. So he starts off ruling Scotland, and then after Elizabeth dies, they need a king. He makes sense. He's ruling Scotland. He's already, and he's the son of Mary, so they install him as king, and so then he becomes both King James VI of Scotland and King James I of England, and he's the first to unify the new crowns. He comes up with the divine right of kings. That's like his major political idea, which is that kings are given the right to rule by God, but must pay attention to tradition or they'll be punished by God. And I think, the mandate of heaven in Chinese history, you can compare it to that. It's not quite the same because for the divine right of kings, they'll be punished by God. He's not saying they'll be punished by anyone else, but he is saying that there is this sense of the justification of the power of kings because of God, because of heaven. James constantly battles with Parliament over money, dismisses them from 1610 to 1621 actually, and rules without them. So a natural question you might ask at this point is, so England does have this strange constitutional monarchy, right? Where they have a king who's powerful enough to dismiss Parliament and start wars. So why would he have Parliament in the first place? Why not just rule on his own? The answer is because, well, it's really hard to raise money. England has a sort of crazy tax system. A lot of it is semi-voluntary. It's very hard to get money from the peasants and whatever. So when you don't have Parliament, you need someone who is very good at raising money, and he had that for a bit, and then eventually found out that wasn't as good, so called Parliament back. During his reign, there's also the first English colony established in America. That's the American continent, which is in Virginia in 1606, growing tobacco. Of course, this tobacco and other cash crops like sugar would eventually form the basis of English economic dominance in like 1700s and 1800s. So this is a pretty exciting time. A lot of the groundwork is being laid right now for England being this great power. It's also this time of conflict over what's the who has the right to rule, like what gives people the right to rule. So another philosopher we'll talk about during this time is John Locke. And you can tell like this was a really real and alive concern when you have a king who's dismissing elected government and ruling on his own. There is a certain question of well, who has what rights? What's the point of any government? What's the point of all of this? By the way, as just a historical side note, speaking of famous Englishmen who were gay, King James I was almost certainly gay. He had a wife who he wasn't really a big fan of, who was like 30 years younger than him. He spent a lot of time with a young, handsome nobleman, and was often openly affectionate with him. And so again, like there is this very weird thing where Francis Bacon is so terrified of being accused of sodomy that he's willing to spend 40 months in prison to avoid being accused, and yet his king is openly gay. So it's a very strange system. But lastly, in terms of historical background, let's talk about science during this time. So science is really reviving. I've sort of included like the 100 years prior because it lets me include the Italian Renaissance. But there is like this very exciting time in which people sort of realize it and sort of don't, but they're really the first ones to discover major things since the Greeks. And there's really a sense of science is finally being pushed forward. So some famous names you should know. We have Galileo, who's actually at the same time as Francis Bacon. Did they know about each other? They really should have. I mean, Francis Bacon certainly should have known about Galileo. He never mentions him, but we have to assume he did. So Galileo is famous for his telescope. He's observing the heavens. He proves Copernicus's theory that the Earth revolves around the sun and the sun doesn't revolve around the Earth. Most amazingly, he tries to use mathematics to predict orbits. And that's actually, although Galileo doesn't really mention it, that's actually a huge step, using mathematics as a means of describing and predicting nature. And by the way, this is 2 pages from Galileo's works, and apparently this is on the moon, and probably on eclipses would be my guess, although perhaps it's on the phases of the moon. So we also get William Gilbert, who discovers magnetism. He's an English scientist, and Francis Bacon does know of this guy, although he's not that impressed with him. He's impressed with the idea of magnetism because magnetism allows for compasses, which are vital for navigation. But he's not very impressed with the way William Gilbert discovers magnetism. He says he just sort of fools around and does experiments and accidentally comes across something amazing. Is that fair? Not really, but we'll talk about that more later. More Italians, we get Vesalius, who sort of discovers all this anatomy, He discovers muscles and veins and a lot of stuff that other people really hadn't before. Um, in fact, Aristotle was famous for trying to figure out anatomy without discussing, which led him to conclude that, for instance, men had more teeth than women, which is just not only like not true, but would have been really easy to check. Uh, Despite that, the myth actually persists up until, well, about this time, because apparently no one ever bothered to just look in a woman's mouth and be like, oh, she has the same number of teeth as a guy does. And that's also, you get another myth during this time from biblical myth that women have more ribs than men, which is slightly more understandable. It's biblically based, and it's, harder to check ribs. But again, like, someone like Vesalius just opens up the body and he's like, oh, that is not true. I can see all the ribs and it's the same number. All right, we get William Harvey, who's actually Francis Bacon's personal physician, but as you learned in the pre-reading, weirdly enough, Francis Bacon doesn't seem to know anything about his science, and he discovers a lot about the heart, about the circulation, and about the heart-lung connection. So the lung oxygenates the blood, right? Finally, we get a German here with Kepler, another one looking up at the stars, who discovers laws of planetary motion. So the weirdest thing about Francis Bacon is he's someone who writes a lot about science and what science should be. He doesn't actually seem to care that much about like the real and important science that's going on. He doesn't really write about it. He doesn't really mention it. And his own attempts at real science aren't that great. For instance, he writes about the tides, trying to figure out why the tides exist, and now we know it's the gravitational pull of the moon. And Francis Bacon comes up with an idea having to do, after Galileo tries to figure out the same problem, having to do with the Earth's orbit. It's completely wrong. And it's sort of an interesting contradiction in Francis Bacon that he's not a great scientist, although he is a great philosopher of science. All right. So that was the history in a nutshell. Now, on to Bacon's philosophy. Before I continue, just going to make a quick check. Everyone can hear me, understand me. Awesome. Then let's continue. On to Bacon's philosophy. All right. So Bacon's philosophy is mostly about science. He does write some philosophy of law. His law philosophy isn't super important. He's most famous for being able to say things really well. And we'll see once we read his actual philosophy. He's a great writer, but his contributions to law aren't that original. And this is an English court around the time that he was a judge. As you can see, it's a pretty informal affair. There's not the same sorts of rules and regulations as there are in modern time, or even 200 years later. Although there is a body of what's called common law being built up, so there is like systematic laws. There's also a very interesting power struggle at this point between who exactly has the right court system, because there are sort of these informal courts, and then there's formal courts, and a lot of it is law set up by commoners versus law set up by nobles. So you get very interesting power struggles that unfortunately I can't go through at this time. But again, in terms of, if you think back to these, I ideas of governance, of who has the right to govern, that's another fascinating question of who has the right to set up a court? Like, who has the right to be a judge? How is a judge chosen? Like, these are all important questions. So we're going to cover Bacon's philosophy of law really quickly, because there are really only 2 points that I think really matter that he made. One is that the law is the guardian of the rights of the people. So in that sense, he is, again, liberal. His idea of law is not, it's a matter of government, or it's to protect kings or whatever. His idea is that law is for the people. On the other hand, he also says law's fundamental tasks are to guard life, guard property, and guard a man's good name. So you can see this is somewhat close to John Locke, life, liberty, and property. It's interesting, as someone like Francis Bacon, the lesson he takes from his imprisonment over corruption is not, well, it wasn't at this point quite yet, but he does get in problems with debtors' prison and whatever. Is his answer to that is not to increase law's protection of liberty, but to increase law's protection of a man's good name, which sort of an interesting take. But let's talk more about his scientific philosophy. All right. So in terms of the issues of Francis Bacon and science, the first question he wants to answer is, why should we do science? So he doesn't say he's a religious man. Whether he's actually religious is impossible to tell, but certainly in his writings he constantly says he's religious, and he believes in God, and he believes in the Bible, and he says basically we've fallen from Eden, right? We've fallen from grace, and Garden of Eden, Garden of Paradise, mankind has dominion over all the animals, and there's no death or unhappiness. So he says science is what we have to help us get the dominion of nature that we had before the fall from grace. So before the fall from grace, we could talk to animals, we could talk to the plants, make them do what we want. The only way we can get that back is through science, through forming, laws about the outside world. And he says, meanwhile, the purpose of religion and faith could help restore man's innocence. So part of this famous, being kicked out of the Garden of Eden was that both Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge. So they gain knowledge of things that they shouldn't, like life and death. And that's sort of our curse, is that we know that, and therefore we can't live in the garden. And so he's saying religion and faith can help restore mankind's innocence, get us free from original sin. And he says science's purpose isn't to question the divine, so don't turn it on heaven. He says question nature, and he's actually pretty big on this. He's very dismissive of people who use science to explain the Bible or to explain biblical stories or anything of the sort. He says the purpose of faith is to believe impossible things, and that's how you show your faith. Is the more impossible the thing you believe, the more faithful you are. Which Russell mentioned, someone else makes fun of by basically writing down like the most ridiculous things you can believe and saying, and if you believe these things, then you're the most faithful. So again, this sort of it gets a little sketchy around the edges, which makes you wonder how much Francis Bacon seems to really believe it, especially as he does seem very intent on carving out a space for science. So what's the purpose of science in terms of the state? Well, this is an important question for Francis Bacon. First of all, because he is continually involved in the state. Second of all, because he writes with a mind to get himself funded by the state. Again, he is a practical guy, and if he can gain something from his writings, he will not hesitate to do so. So he says the state should fund and regulate science. And that's, first of all, so we can establish dominion over nature. And second of all, because he says if we apply science to government, we can remove ourselves from the cycle of history. And the cycle of history is this cycle where we go from tyranny to liberty to tyranny to liberty. And he's saying what we really need is a scientific government, like just figure out the best way to do government. And then we can remove ourselves from this cycle. We can finally have a good government and a good society. By the way, this picture at the bottom here is Harvey showing circulation. So that's Bacon's physician. So here's some interesting stuff here. So first of all, the state should fund and regulate science. Science isn't really even identified at this point as a separate thing you can do. So saying the state should fund and regulate it is fascinating and very prescient, right? Because that's basically the foundation of modern science in the 20th and 21st century has been state-funded, state-regulated. And again, like, it is pretty impressive for him to sort of identify and call that out. Also, in terms of scientific government, that's something that's tried a lot in various forms throughout history, sometimes better, sometimes worse. I think, though, the idea of having approaching science or approaching government from a scientific point of view, I mean, that is pretty amazing. We do later on get the field called political science, which some of you might have studied. So, Francis Bacon saw that coming. All right, last up. We've talked about science. He says science is to establish dominion over nature. Science is to question nature. Science can improve government. So what is science? How do we do it? So he says science should be accomplished by eliminative induction, from observed fact to axiom to physical law. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, what is induction? Induction is a style of reasoning based on patterns. So the most basic form of induction is called enumerative induction, which is essentially just if you see something happening again and again, you guess it's going to happen the next time. So why do I think that the sun is going to rise tomorrow morning? Or why do I think that the Earth's not going to explode in 5 minutes? Well, because the Earth hasn't exploded yet, because the sun has risen every morning since I've been alive and since everyone I know have been alive. So I'm going to make a pretty good guess that that's going to happen the next time. So again, there's a problem with enumerative induction, which Russell talks about in the pre-reading, where he says the problem with enumerative induction is that it's easy to make a mistake. So he gives the example of a census taker who's going from house to house in Scotland, and he finds, William Williams, William Williams, William Williams, and he reaches like the 10th house, and he's like, I give up. Everyone's obviously named William Williams. And so he just writes down everyone's name in the town as William Williams. But unfortunately, he was wrong. There was a guy in a house, 20 doors down whose name was John Johnson. And so the census taker was wrong. So that is a problem with induction, and Bacon will spend some time trying to figure that out. But so what's the purpose of induction in Bacon's mind? Well, first you start off with an observed fact, and then you go to an axiom. So you say, first, this happened when this happened. I dropped an apple and it fell, right? It fell to the ground. Then you go to an axiom. An axiom is a rule that's always true. So he says, I dropped an apple and it fell. You do that enough times, eventually you say, every time I drop an apple, it falls. And finally, you go to a physical law, which is that things fall. Or eventually, gravity attracts things together. And big things exert a larger force than smaller things. So Bacon, remember, he's not in the mathematical mode like Galileo is, so he doesn't think of physical laws as something you'd express mathematically, but he does have that same sort of pattern where you go from a fact to something that always happens to generalization. So by the way, as long as we're talking about inductions, we should also talk about deductions, which Bacon is not a fan of. So deductions are logical conclusions. Sort of the most famous example of a deduction is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And mortal means can die, right? All men can die, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates can die. And that's the that's the state of a lot of philosophy, a lot of Greek philosophy. They have this system where they set up these rules and then they logically conclude from the rules. And as we'll see, Bacon says, you'll never learn anything from the outside world by trying to reason like that. Like you start off with stuff you don't really know about, and then you logically reason yourself to something that's not true. It's not a great way. And then finally, he says, in order to perform induction, we need to have very clear minds. We need to think like scientists. And it's hard to think like a scientist because we have these like 4 idols which can cloud our thoughts. So here's like sort of an important thing to note is idols is not commonly used in this way. Idol is sort of a special word. Normally it means a statue, but for Bacon it means a confusion. So just remember that in normal English, idol does not mean this, but for Bacon, idol does mean this. So he says, first we can have idols of the tribe, which are common to our race. So this is something that all human beings make mistakes about. There are idols of the den, confusions of the den, which belong to an individual. So this is the sort of confusion that a certain individual will have. Idols of the marketplace are confusions of the marketplace, which come from misusing language. So this is confusion from imprecise language. So if you remember Aquinas, and he talks about how words can be used to describe different things for different reasons, like that's, they're actually both on the same sort of thought process there. And finally, we get idols of the theater, which come from philosophy. And he says this is specifically like people get the wrong ways of thinking from philosophy, and they get confused by that. And you notice here, I didn't put actually how Francis Bacon really says we should do science, like his precise method. It's because his precise method is actually pretty silly. It's sort of, again, Francis Bacon is so brilliant right up until the point you actually ask him to do science, and then he's not so brilliant. And I'll tell you his precise method. He says if you want to find out a fact about a physical law, or you need to find out about a phenomenon, you basically write down a bunch of observations about every single case which has the phenomenon you can think of, and then you write down a set of observations which every single case which has the phenomenon you can't think of, and then you come up with rules from there. So for instance, he really famously did this with heat, and he writes down this super long list of like 60 things where he goes from like the rays of the sun are hot, and fire is hot, and the insides of animals are hot, And if you like have really strong vinegar, which like burns your skin, that's hot. And if you eat spicy food, that's hot. And this is his like attempt to find out what makes things hot. And the funny thing is he actually has a pretty good idea. He says it's like, small things in the object are vibrating, which is heat, right? That's heat. The molecules moving fast. So he has the right idea, but his method of trying to find it out is just really silly. So yeah, it's sort of hard to explain how he can be such a great scientist up until the point he does science. All right. So yeah, here we go. Oh, this is so de calore, de a frigore of heat and cold. So, for instance, the caves under the earth noted to be warmer in winter than the summer, and so the waters that spring from within the earth. Great quantities of sulfur, and sometimes naturally burning in Iceland. Um, Trees full of tar, which can be burned. Sunbeams on reflection. Magnifying glasses. Sunbeams are hotter perpendicularly than obliquely. I don't really know what he means by that. Sunbeams raise vapors out of the earth, which go back from dews. Now he just seems to be talking about sunbeams a lot. Sunbeams take away the smell of flowers. I don't think that's true. Sunbeams ripen fruits. And yeah, this is sort of his, again, like this is him trying to figure out heat. He's just writing down random things. Oh, this one is really bad. Almost all flies love the sunbeams. So do snakes. Toads and worms the contrary. So like, again, you wonder why exactly he thinks this is going to give him an idea of heat. If he says flies love sunbeams. Like, that's not how you figure out science. But anyways, so how does Bacon come up with this stuff? Why is he thinking about this stuff? Well, because Bacon's philosophy can be seen as a rejection of Aristotle's dominance, which again is amazing. This is, almost 2,000 years after Aristotle lives, and Francis Bacon, as an educated man, is still having problems with having to argue against, Aristotle. It's pretty an impressive accomplishment on the part of Aristotle to have influence that lasts that long, and it is unfortunate that so much of what Aristotle thought about science is not only wrong, but as Bacon puts it, barren. And it's also, we can also see it in the light of new discoveries, especially in Italy. Again, I'm going from the assumption here that Bacon was familiar with these, even if he didn't discuss them a ton. All right. So first of all, Aristotle. As I mentioned, he's trained in Aristotelian science at Cambridge, but he rejects it. As you guys know from our class on Thomas Aquinas, Aristotelian science, it attempts to make sense of the outside world by applying Socrates' method to it, right? There's reason and deduction and this, therefore this, and they end up classifying everything. So, there's like the four causes of everything, and there's like how it's made, what makes it like come to be, like what it does. And this is so foreign from our idea of what science should be. And a lot of that comes from, Bacon, of what science should be. And in terms of sort of the climate at the time, I think it was easier for Bacon than it would be for someone in Spain or Italy at the time to reject Aristotle outright, because England has already rejected the Catholic Church, which means someone like Thomas Aquinas, who still has an enormous amount of sway in Catholic countries, For someone in England, they can just, sort of ignore him. Like they can be like, yeah, whatever. Thomas Aquinas, he wasn't that smart. Who cares what he thought? By the way, this is a comic here I found. Don't tell me what Aristotle says. He still believes men have more teeth than women. So, yeah. All right, Italian science. So on the right here, we have Vesalius, and this is the muscles. And it's actually pretty amazing, right? He's an amazing artist and also obviously amazing at dissecting based on how detailed these muscle fabrics are. And that's the name of Vesalius's famous work, of course, De Fabrica, literally the things that make up men. So, yeah, throughout the Italian Renaissance, so you think like, well, late 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, there are these great strides made in painting, sculpture, and engineering. Like that's the time of Da Vinci, that's the time of Michelangelo, and they managed to make these strides in painting and sculpture and engineering because they make these advances in anatomy and they make these advances in practical geometry. How to apply geometry to the real world to create, for instance, Da Vinci creates helicopters and flying machines and whatever. So it's pretty amazing because they don't quite realize it in Italy. There's a sense that they realize it, but they don't realize the importance. They're discovering like new and important things. These are things the Greeks didn't know. These are things the Arabs didn't know, although the Arabs, made their own discoveries. The Muslim world made their own discovery. And they're being discovered through this careful observation. And it's not science. Like there's not hypothesis and there's not experiments. But there is the sense for someone like Vesalius that if you want to know what a body is, you don't go and like think about it for a really long time like Aristotle would. And you don't try to reason it logically. What you do is you get a corpse or a bunch of corpses, a bunch of bodies from a graveyard, and you dissect it. You take a knife and you draw what you see. And so that's what he does. And that's what Da Vinci does. And that's what Michelangelo does. And it's like, it sounds so basic, but it is this amazing advance of that is what science should be. Science should be things, yeah, you can reason, but you need to directly base it in what you see and what you get from your senses. Like you can't just try to figure everything out through deduction. So yeah, we have to assume that Bacon knew about this, and these are sort of his influences. He's rejecting Aristotle. He's refining the Italians, and he's coming up with a scientific method. All right. Last thing before the break is we're going to do, let's cover the text we'll actually be covering, which is Novum Organum. Or if you want to say it as someone in his time would say it, or as anyone speaking Latin would say it, Novum Organum, because these are W's in Latin. All right, so it literally means a new instrument of science. Novum Organum Scientiarum means a new instrument of science. And by the way, Latin is a very interesting language. I'll just tell you this really briefly because I studied Latin. So the way Latin works is the ending of each word tells you exactly what its grammatical use is. So this arum ending here means of science, so means belonging to science. And then novum organum, those are both mean, they're the subjects, so new instrument belonging to science. But yeah, and it's written in Latin because that's the language of educated people. So it's very explicitly written to an educated audience. It's not written to be popular to the masses. Like, Shakespeare is written so it appeals to educated people and non-educated people. Bacon stuff is written very specifically for people like him who studied at Cambridge and Oxford and whatever. So it's published in 1620. So here our cover is a galleon, which is just a huge ship that was popular at the time for trade and for military purposes, sailing between the mythical Pillars of Hercules. And that's the Greeks had the Pillars of Hercules, as that was the boundary of between the Mediterranean Sea, the Atlantic Ocean. So if you can picture in your mind, the Mediterranean Sea is this circle, and then it sort of gets pinched off here, and then you get the Atlantic Ocean. So this is like the Pillars of Hercules. And the idea is the Mediterranean Sea is safe and calm, and the Atlantic Ocean is huge and unknown and scary. So that's his new instrument. His ship is sailing out from the safe and calm into the unknown and scary. This Latin inscription at the bottom: many will travel and knowledge will be increased. So yeah, pretty exciting stuff. But before we begin with all that, let's take a 5-minute break so you can use the bathroom, eat some food, whatever. And I'll see you back here at 10:05 on my clock. All right, see you in a bit. Everyone good? Ready to start? All right, let's begin. All right, so again, we're talking about the Novum Organum Scientiarum, which, as I saw someone was discussing in the comments, Scientiarum is the genitive case. All right, so let's start with the preface. So what Bacon lays out with the preface is, first, what's been done wrong before. So he says, those who have taken upon them to lay down the law of nature as a thing already searched out and understood, whether they have spoken in a simple assurance or professional affectation, have therein done philosophy and the sciences great injury. So people who've said, we already know the laws of nature, whether they're, sure of themselves or they're just saying it because they want to keep their job, either way, they're really, done science like a great injury. So, as they have been successful in inducing belief, so they have been effective in quenching and stopping inquiry, and have done more harm by spoiling and putting an end to other men's efforts than good by their own. So he says, basically, have you been successful in inducing beliefs? So basically, they've made people already think that science is known. There's nothing more to find out. So they've stopped other people from trying to find anything out, and which means if they've stopped other people from finding things out, then whatever else they've done in their life they've done way more harm already. So they're not great people. On the other hand, he says, those who have taken a contrary view or a contrary course and asserted that absolutely nothing can be known. So he says, if he's saying, if you say you can't know anything, as opposed to these people who say we already know everything, we say they can't know anything, whether it were from hatred of the ancient sophists or from uncertainty and fluctuation from mind, or even from a kind of fullness of learning, they fell upon this opinion. So they say you can't know anything either because they hate the ancient philosophers and they're like, they were all, just liars and they, trying to trick people. Or maybe these people they're not really sure what they think. Or maybe they're just sort of full of learning. Like they've had all the learning and it's just too much learning and they've gotten to the point where like, I've learned so much that I don't think anything can be known. And he says, so these sorts of people, they've advanced reasons for this idea that are not to be despised. So, people who say we can't know anything aren't as bad as people who say we already know everything, but still, they have neither started from true principles nor rested in the just conclusion, zeal and affectation having carried them too far. So, they started at the wrong place when they thought we couldn't know anything. They ended in the wrong place when thought couldn't know anything. And his basic summing up of them is zeal and affectation have carried them much too far, way too far. They're just so excited about this idea they can't know anything. So, short conclusion, there are two types of people who've done bad stuff. People who say nature is already understood and people who say nature cannot be known. Both of them are mistaken and both of them have done a disservice to philosophy. By the way, really quickly, I saw in the comments someone said they didn't understand this picture. So really quickly, this picture is about circulation. And so this is Harvey describing the veins, right? Veins carry blood back to the heart. And so he's tied this tourniquet around, makes the veins pop out. You grip the stick hard. So he's just discovering the veins and it's someone pointing them out. Not important. All right. So, preface, two types of people. Next up. So, what is Bacon's alternative to this? To we already know everything versus we know nothing. He says, well, how about this? He says, I propose to establish progressive stages of certainty. So we're gonna say we're gonna start from nothing and eventually go to we know a lot. He says the evidence of the sense, helped and guarded by a certain process of correction, I retain. So using what we see and what we hear and what we smell, and being careful about that, he's gonna keep that. But what's gonna be different? The mental operation which follows the act of sense, I for the most part reject, and instead of it, I open and lay out a new and certain path for the mind to proceed in, starting directly from the simple sensuous perception. And he says the mind must be guided from the outside. So essentially he's saying, yeah, I'm going to keep seeing, hearing, smelling, whatever, but after that, we need to come up with a better process. Like we need a very certain path that we're going to think about whatever we see. We have to guide from the outside, right? He says he agrees with observation, but he wants a new method for how to process and understand observation, not just blindly thinking. And he actually says in his preface, his new method of thinking is going to be like machinery, when the old method was like building with bare hands. So he says, like, imagine building a house with no hammers, no nails, nothing, just like your bare hands. That was the old method of science. His new method of science is like going to be building a house with a hammer and nails. It's a new instrument, right? It's this new powerful instrument. So, who is this book written for? It's not written for philosophers. It's not written for ethicists. It's not written for logicians. It's not written basically for anyone who's thinking about things inside, thinking about the ideal version of things, thinking about how we should act. It's a new sort of person he's writing this for. It's a different sort of person. It's someone who seeks certain knowledge. But if there be any man who, not content to rest and use the knowledge which has already been discovered, aspires to penetrate further. So if there's any man who's not content to, sort of rest and use the knowledge which has already been discovered, so he's not content to just, relax and use what other people have found, he wants to do more. He wants to overcome not an adversary in argument, but nature in action. So he's overcoming not someone in an argument, but he wants to overcome nature, right? He's seeking not pretty improbable conjectures, but certain and demonstrable knowledge. So these are all people who they're trying to find out things about the world. They're not trying to win an argument. They're not trying to become famous or rich by being clever arguers. They're trying to gain knowledge about the world. And so here I have Galileo moving the earth with a lever. So again, we don't hear from Bacon about Galileo, but we have to imagine that he's the sort of guy that Bacon is talking about, right? Someone who is trying to find out knowledge about the world. All right. So that's the end of the preface. So that's the end of like the very short start of the book. And we're going to go through the whole book one of aphorisms. And aphorisms, it's interesting. So now we use them as like pithy sayings, right? So even Bacon's famous saying, which you've probably heard of, knowledge is power, right? That's an aphorism. Aphorisms he's using here is something different. It's like distinct short paragraphs, couple sentences, sometimes connected, sometimes disconnected. It was a common means of writing an argument or a book then. It's a little distracting to read directly now. But so this is what he's calling it though, book one, aphorisms. So, question is Bacon the first one to come up with this? No, he's not. He says the study of nature with a view to works is engaged in by the mechanic, the mathematician, the physician, the alchemist, and the magician, but by all, as all things now are, with slight endeavor and scanty success. So he says, other people have also tried to figure out how nature works. The mechanic has, so, people who build things, the mathematician, the physician, the doctor, the alchemist. Alchemists are people who try to make gold. And a lot of our early chemistry actually comes from alchemists trying to make gold. For instance, the way phosphorus was discovered, one of the elements was by a guy, an English scientist, boiling urine to try to find gold. He boiled 1,500 gallons of urine and discovered this sort of shimmering substance, which was phosphorus. And the magician, which presumably you guys know what a magician is, and he says none of these people have done all that well. And here we have an alchemist trying to discover gold. And we have, again, as I mentioned, foundations of chemistry. This certainly looks like chemistry, like a beaker or a flask. But what exactly he's doing with it is obviously something more mysterious. So the question you might ask is, don't we already know a lot of things? And he says, well, the productions of the mind and hand seem very numerous in books and manufactures. But all this variety lies in exquisite subtlety and derivations from a few things already known, not in the number of axioms. So he says, you might think we know a lot of things because we make a lot of things and we make a lot of books. But he says, it's not actually like a lot of, if you delve down into what the basic things are, we don't know that many basic things. We just know a few basic things, and we've gotten a lot from these few basic things. Okay, so why is no one experiencing success so far? Why is everyone failed? Why are the magicians failing? Why are the mechanics failing? Why are the physicians failing? Well, the subtlety of nature is greater many times over than the subtlety of the senses and understanding. So that all those specious meditations, speculations, and glosses in which men indulge are quite from the purpose, only there is no one by to observe it. So he says, nature is tricky, it's subtle, there's all these small things, and it's much harder to understand, it's much more clever than we can understand by just our pure senses and understanding, like just looking at things and thinking about it. So he says all those specious, all those false meditations, speculations, and glosses. So everything we think about aren't really, they're quite from the purpose. And we'd know that if we could just look at ourselves, but we can't. So we don't realize how far off we are. And he says attempts to understand nature by logic are just not good enough. Like, Aristotelians tried. The syllogism consists of propositions. So syllogism, Socrates is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? Syllogism consists of propositions. Propositions consist of words. Words are symbols of notions. Therefore, if the notions themselves, which is the root of the matter, are confused and overly hastily abstracted from the facts, there can be no firmness in the superstructure. So he's saying, like, you think it's pure logic when you're dealing with a syllogism. But really, you're dealing with words. And when you're dealing with words, you're dealing with your understanding of things. So if you don't understand things very well, then no matter how good your logic is, like, you're starting off, it's like building, on sand. It's going to fall over. So his only hope is a true induction. And again, induction, reasoning from a pattern. All right. He says, what if we just tried to understand what we observe? And that's what the alchemists are doing. They're just trying really hard to understand what exactly they're seeing. And he says, well, no. Understanding left to itself takes the same course, namely the former, which it takes in accordance with logical order. For the mind longs to spring up to positions of higher generality, that it may find rest there, so after a little while wearies of the experiment. But this evil is increased by logic because of the order and solemnity of its disputations. And I actually really like this. It's, if you've ever watched like TV news, I mean, I don't watch Chinese TV, but American TV news, like you always see like the news anchors, they get a little bit of information and then they try to make this huge proclamation based on it. And he says, like, that's even worse when they're trying to be logical, because then they're really sure that they're right, when really they're just taking a little bit of information. And it's like, it's so much easier to say something big and sweeping off something little, like, based on this poll, Hillary Clinton will win the election. Like, that's so much easier than trying to actually do the work. He's saying that's what everyone does. It's just sort of a natural thing. He says, and science is founded on opinions and dogmas. So the use of anticipations and logic is good. For in them, the object is command assent to the proposition, not to master the thing. So this is, of course, being rather biting, right? He says, if you're trying to come up with science founded on opinions and dogmas, so dogma is just something you believe without evidence. So if that's your idea of science, that it's just going to be like what you think and what you believe in evidence, then yeah, go ahead, use logic. And he says, yeah, if that's what you want, then you can command assent to the proposition. So if all you're trying to do is prove what you say is right, then use logic. But if what you're trying to do is actually know if what you say is right, then the use of anticipations and logic is not the right thing. So, what blocks us from true understanding? Well, it's idols. So there are 4 classes of idols which beset men's minds. So to these, for distinction's sake, I have assigned names, calling the first class idols of the tribe, The second, idols of the cave. The third, idols of the marketplace. The fourth, idols of the theater. So again, as I mentioned, this is what people normally mean by an idol. So if you hear the word idol in English, like idol worship, or sometimes they call celebrities like teen idols. It means like because people worship them. So Bacon is using it in an unusual way here. I'm not exactly sure where he gets the word idol from. It might have been common during his time, it might not have been. But again, when you hear it on TV or in a movie, they don't mean it the way Bacon means it. Bacon means it as like something which confuses us. So, what are idols of the tribe? Well, idols of the tribe have their foundation in human nature itself, and in the tribe or race of men. The human understanding is like a false mirror, which receiving rays irregularly distorts and discolors the nature of things by mingling its own nature with it. So he says idols of the tribe are like what all men, the mistakes that all men make. And again, Francis Bacon, he's living at a time before he's even really thinking about what women think. So as most people during that time, he says, the tribe or race of men. Now we can just think about the tribe or race of people. He says it's like a mirror. Like if you've ever seen a funhouse mirror, like one of those mirrors you look in and it makes you look really fat or really thin, that's what human understanding is. It tricks you. You don't see the true thing because you color it with your own understanding. And then we get idols of the cave, or the idols of the individual man. Once it was well observed by Heraclitus that men look for sciences in their own lesser worlds, not in the greater common world. One thing is really interesting about Bacon is, so he doesn't like Aristotle. He likes Heraclitus a lot, who's a philosopher, a pre-Socratic philosopher. We won't go too much into him because he's not, Bacon is the only one who really seems to like him that much. This is a good quote though. Men look for sciences in their own lesser world and not in the greater common world. So the idea is when we look for knowledge, what we really look for is like what's immediate around us. Like that's our idea of what's true, is what we can see immediately, rather than what's true for everyone. Thirdly, there are idols formed by the intercourse and association of men with each other, which I call idols in the marketplace, on account of the commerce and consort of men there. Words plainly force and overrule the understanding, throw all into confusion, and lead men away into numberless empty controversies, idle fancies. So these are confusions because men talk with each other. And he calls these idols of the marketplace because, for him, that's where he always sees men talking with each other. And he says, words force and overrule the understanding, which is an interesting way of putting it, right? You normally think of, you use words to communicate your understanding. But according to Bacon, no, words force your understanding. They confuse you when you try to put things into words. And it leads men away into numberless empty controversies and idle fancies. So arguments which have no purpose and ideas which are, pointless. Finally, fourthly, idols which have immigrated into men's minds from various dogmas of philosophies and also from wrong laws of demonstration. These are called idols of the theater because, in my judgment, all the received systems are but so many stage plays representing worlds of their own creation after an unreal and scenic fashion. So, Bacon, he's starting this new philosophy. He has this, I have this new instrument of science, so he has to tear down the old stuff. And he says, various dogmas of philosophies. So again, beliefs without any evidence, wrong laws of demonstration. So, how you should be figuring things out. And he calls these idols of the theater because he says none of these are really science. All of these are just they're just plays. They're worlds of their own creation. They have nothing to do with the real world. All right. So we've got our four idols. idols that everyone has, confusions everyone has, confusion that each person has, confusion that language has, and confusion that philosophy caused. All right, let's go into idols of the tribe. So confusion that everyone has. So again, he puts these as aphorisms, right? So he just lists them out. It's a little confusing because there isn't a great organization, and some of the things he lists out are really brilliant and I love, and some of them are like, not so great. So I put the ones that I thought were particularly well reasoned here. I couldn't put all of them because the whole thing, even just book one, is way too long. All right. So the human understanding is of its own nature prone to suppose the existence of more order and regularity in the world than it finds. So everyone automatically thinks that the world has order. The world isn't in chaos. So for example, you might think people are dying because they did something bad. Or you might think something good happens to someone because they were a good person. And you sometimes even hear people say that, like, oh, everything works out as it should. And according to Bacon, that's an example of a very common confusion that people have, that the world makes sense. And the world doesn't necessarily make sense. The world doesn't necessarily have the order that people expect it to. Number two, human understanding, when it is once adopted an opinion, either as being the received opinion or as being agreeable to itself, draws all things else to support and agree with it. So this is actually a lot of these things, it's pretty impressive. A lot of these things only get really named and classified with psychology in the 20th century. So this is an example of like, well, this is generally speaking about the just world fallacy, although there are other stuff too. Here we have confirmation bias. So confirmation bias just means once you believe something, you start only noticing the things that would support it. So for example, a gambler, thinks he has lucky underwear or lucky socks. So every time he goes to gamble, he wears that underwear or that socks. Everyone around him can be like, hey, don't you remember that time you wore your lucky underwear and you still lost all your money? Or that time you didn't wear your lucky underwear and you still won a bunch of money? But this gambler, he's not gonna pay attention to that. He's like, oh, but that time I won all that money, I had put on my underwear the day before, but the time I wore the underwear and I lost all my money, well, I had washed it the day before, so like really it's still my lucky underwear. So no matter what happens, they're automatically going to try to support their idea that this is my lucky underwear. They're not going to accept anything that disproves that. Thirdly, the human understanding is moved by those things most which strike and enter the mind simultaneously and suddenly, so fill the imagination. Then it feigns and supposes all other things to be somehow, though it cannot see how, similar to those few things by which it is surrounded. So he's saying people are most moved by things which instantly imagine fill their minds. So you might really like a certain TV show, right? And if I asked you, how popular do you think that TV show is? You like it and your friends like it, so you're like, oh, everyone likes it. It's super popular. Now, you don't know that. It might be you and your friends are the only people who like that TV show, and there might be another TV show which is way more popular and just you don't watch. And that's probably true, right? There are probably some things that are very, very popular that you personally don't participate in. And so if someone asks you what are popular things, well, you can't think of them. Or you won't give a right answer because the answer you give is based on what immediately comes to your mind, not necessarily what's true. And what immediately comes to your mind, you assume is true for everything. All right, let's continue on with idols of the tribe. So, other things. Here he says problems with infinity. And by the way, I put it's a Mobius strip, right?
so it never ends. You have the same path on and on and on. And this is, I believe this is Escher who drew these ants and made like sort of this impossible drawing. Pretty cool. All right. Therefore, it is that we cannot conceive of any end or limit to the world, but always as of necessity it occurs to us that there is something beyond. Neither again can it be conceived how eternity has flowed down to the present day. That distinction which is commonly received of infinity in time past and in time to come can by no means hold, for it would thence follow that one infinity is greater than another, then infinity is wasting away and tending to become finite. The like subtlety arises touching the infinite divisibility of lines and the same inability of thought to stop. So again, he's talking about like infinity. He's saying we can't think of an end to the world. We always think there must be something beyond. And it says, and we can't think about how that, and we can't think of how there was always, we think there was always something before us. And he says that can't be true. It's not that there's always something before us and always something after us. And his argument for this is that one infinity, that would mean one infinity is greater than another. That infinity is wasting away and tending to become finite. So it doesn't make sense that, you know, if today there's an infinity of time before us, an infinity of time after us, then what would happen tomorrow? Well, that would mean tomorrow is infinity plus one time before us, and after us is infinity minus one time. He says we're just really bad about thinking about infinity. One thing that's ironic here is, as we know, this is pre-calculus, because this is before Newton. As we know, Bacon's understanding of infinity here isn't great either, and sort of his dealings with infinity and infinite sets. But, there's only so much one man can do. So Bacon here is specifically referring to Aquinas. He's rejecting his argument about like the first cause. Remember, so like first cause, there had to be a first cause. Elsewise, things would be infinite. So something had to start things off. Okay, titles of the tribe continued. So confusion shared of all mankind. So man rejects difficult things from impatience of research, sober things because they narrow hope. So here he's talking about scientists. And again, this is actually pretty amazing. It's pretty prescient. So now we have what are called double-blind studies. So when you do science, if any of you guys did research, you'll know that you have to make sure whatever you're experimenting on, if you're like experimenting on people, they can't know what the study is about, and the scientist who's doing the study can't know which subjects are which while he's doing the study, because you'll unconsciously or automatically reject anything that disagrees with you. Like there's a very famous study done where these scientists were sent mice, and they were told that some of the mice were faster than others, other of the mice were slower than others, and they just said, can you run them through this maze and make sure that like this is correct? What the scientists didn't know is all the mice were randomly assigned. So none of the mice were faster than any others. And yet, every single lab, and these are labs in important universities, every single lab said, oh yeah, no, you're totally right. These are fast mice and slow mice. And they had actual evidence, and they had like their books with the mice's times. And it wasn't something that should be able to be falsified. Like the mice should have ran the same speed, but because the scientists were told beforehand that these are fast mice and these are slow mice, they found, lo and behold, that they had fast mice and slow mice. So it's actually a pretty important cognitive bias. Okay, continued. But by far the greatest hindrance and aberration of the human understanding proceeds from the dullness and competency and deceptions of the senses, and that things which strike the sense outweigh things which do not immediately strike it, though they be more important. Hence it is that speculation commonly ceases where sight ceases, insomuch that of things invisible there is little or no observation. And again, it's pretty amazing he's saying this, because this is before they discover bacteria. He says there's bias towards things that we can see and touch. People always underestimate the importance of things they can't see. I mean, it's only very recently, for instance, we understand how important bacteria are in human digestion and the human immune system, and we just never thought about it because we couldn't see them. You know, you can see the intestines, but you can't see the bacteria in the intestines. It says matter, finally, says matter rather than forms, matter rather than forms should be the object of our attention. It's configurations and changes of configuration, and simple action and law of action or motion. For forms are figments of the human mind, unless you will call those laws of action forms. So specifically, he says, Aristotle, stop caring so much about causes. And it's funny because he calls out Aristotle later by name. But here, even with his like problems with all of mankind, he says, or confusions of all of mankind, he says, pay attention to what's actually happening. Don't care so much about the forms of things. Like, you might, like, don't, whatever you're saying about what the true form of a cup is, or of a dog, or a horse, or whatever, like, or the true forms of motion, it doesn't matter. These are just things you're making up. You're not actually seeing what's going on. You're just seeing, you know, you're just engaging in idle speculation. All right. That covers idols of the tribe. Everyone good? All right. Let's continue on to idols of the cave. All right. So, what are idols of the cave? Idols of the cave are idols which are specific to certain people. So, we just covered idols of the tribe, which are problems everyone has. Idols of the cave are things which are specific to certain people. So he says, men become attached to certain particular sciences and speculations, either because they fancy themselves the authors and inventors thereof, or because they have bestowed the greatest pains upon them and become most habituated to them. This is, of course, something that Bacon sees, as he is a, you know, he is a scientist and whatever. He sees people get attached to certain ideas, certain logic. It's like the American saying to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So you have this idea and you just like, yeah, everything needs to fit this idea. He also says other differences. There is one principle, and as it were, radical distinction between different minds in respect of philosophy and the science, which is this, that some minds are stronger and apter to mark the differences of things, others to mark their resemblances. And this is important because classification is a very important part of philosophy, and of science rather. And classification really depends on who's classifying. So there was a famous sort of study where when they were trying to catalog all the bird species in America around the end of the 1800s, you know, these two separate scientists, both, they had the same collection. One of them came up with, I think it was like 70 different bird species in America, the other one 200, right? So the one who came up with 200, he was a scientist who was more apt to mark the differences of things. The one who said 70, you know, more apt to mark their resemblances. And that's always a problem, is certain people have certain biases. All right, so that covers it. That's his sort of, yeah. All right, so there are found some minds given to an extreme admiration of antiquity, others to an extreme love and appetite for novelty. This shouldn't be too complicated. Some people really love honoring old philosophers, old scientists. You know, some people are like, if Aristotle didn't say it, then I'm not going to believe it. Other people really, really love novelty. They're like, we got to tear down everything else. You know, we've got to start anew. And what they believe is going to be based on whether they want to stick with Aristotle or whether they want to do something different. And he says, finally, contemplations of nature and of bodies in their simple form break up and distract the understanding, while contemplations of nature and bodies in their composition and configuration overpower and dissolve the understanding. Which, again, is like, it depends on how you look at things. So I studied geosciences in university, and geosciences is science of the earth, right? So if you want to understand how rocks move, on the one hand, you might model a whole rock as just like one body, and then like a whole another huge rock as another like body, and so you treat it really simply. And on the one hand, your calculations are super easy. On the other hand, there's some sense where you're not really understanding the right thing. Like if you're just treating it as like two, you know, circles in space, you're distracting the understanding. On the other hand, if you try to treat it as each particle individually, each molecule individually, each pebble individually, it overpowers the understanding. Like you can't work with it that way. So again, you know, different people have different biases, and the answers they'll come up with depends on how, you know, which way they sort of think about science. And in terms of antiquity, I just put a picture of the Sphinx. I didn't have a great, maybe in retrospect, I should have put one of Aristotle, pages from Aristotle, but instead I put a picture of the Sphinx. All right, so that's it for idols of the cave. So let's do idols of the marketplace. So, idols of the marketplace are confusions which come from language, right? Language which overpowers understanding. So we get two of them. We get two idols of the marketplace. First is there are there names of things which do not exist, for there are things left unnamed through lack of observation. So likewise are there names which result from fantastic suppositions to which nothing in reality corresponds, or they are names of things which exist, but yet confused and ill-defined and hastily and irregularly derived from realities. So he says sometimes you have names for things which don't exist. So he says, just like, you know, if you haven't seen something, you're not going to name it. Sometimes you think you saw something and you name it, but it doesn't exist. And on the other hand, there are also names of things which do exist, but they're so confused and ill-defined that they might as well not exist. And why is that like a confusion which can cloud your thoughts? Well, for instance, you know, people used to think mermaids were real. So women which had the bodies of fish and lived in the oceans. Any of you guys have seen Ariel, the Little Mermaid? Exactly. And you can imagine sailors in the British Navy, once you're sailing at sea for several months, you see something which sort of looks like a woman, and you're like, oh my God, I just saw a mermaid, because you've heard of mermaids, right? Unfortunately, you've never heard of manatees, which is what you actually saw, which is an aquatic mammal, and they're really cute. And I guess you can understand how if you're sleep deprived and you haven't, and you're, you know, surrounded by all guys and you haven't seen women for 3 months, you might think you saw a mermaid. But in fact, you just saw this guy, or maybe this girl. I really don't know how you can tell whether it's male or female. It is really cute though, but definitely not a mermaid. All right, so on the other hand, we've got a different confusion from language. The other class, which springs out of a faulty and unskillful abstraction, is intricate and deeply rooted. Accordingly, when you come to apply the word, if you take it in one sense, flame is humid, then another, air is not humid, if in another, fine dust is humid, then another, glass is humid. So that is easy to see that the notion is taken by abstraction only from water and common and ordinary liquids without any due verification. So here he's saying this is another confusion which comes from language. So he uses the word humid here in a very old meaning. This isn't a way people use humid anymore. He's using the word humid as meaning like water. So he says you can understand how flame sort of like water, air not like water, dust sort of like water, glass is sort of like water, because all of them flow and meanwhile air doesn't flow. But you think you're coming up with science. You think you're coming up with real science here, but according to Bacon, you're not. What you're really just coming up with is words. So you've tricked yourself. You've tricked yourself into thinking you found something out, for instance, about flame, when really you just made a sort of clever, wordplay or a sort of clever description of flame. All right. And then lastly, we have idols of theater, which are problems from philosophy. And he actually starts off with saying, oh, I shouldn't mention any. Like, I'm going to leave the honor of the ancients untouched. Like, you're just going to have to assume that, there are these problems which people come from philosophy. And then it's actually really funny. He says, but, just let me mention a couple. Like, I just need to mention like one or two like little things. And then he just goes about and he wrecks all the old philosophies. And here I put an ancient statue with its head smashed off to represent what he does to other forms of philosophy. Okay, so his first problem is, of course, with Aristotle. He says Aristotle corrupted natural philosophy by its logic. If he had come to his conclusion before, he did not consult experience, as he should have done for the purpose of framing his decisions and axioms, but having first determined the question according to his will. So, this might remind you of Bertrand Russell's criticism of Aquinas. He's not a real philosopher. He has the idea before he comes up with his arguments. And it's the same thing, Bacon is saying, Aristotle, he's not a real scientist. He comes up with an idea, and then he comes up with evidence. When a real scientist comes up with evidence, then an idea. Okay. Second, people who are wrong or messed up. It says empiricists. What are empiricists? Well, empiricists are people who come from things from experiments. He says they had their foundations not in the light of common notions, which, though it be a faint and superficial light, is yet in a manner universal and has reference to many things, but in the narrowness and darkness of a few experiments. This is weird, right? What is his problem with experiments? Like, this is Francis Bacon, this is the first scientist, the founder of the scientific method, and he's complaining about these guys doing experiments? Like, what's going on? Okay, well, he explains this because I guess he figures a lot of people would have this confusion. So he says, what they intimate is how far, not by what means or from what source. They do not suggest anything with regard either to the desires of bodies or to the development of their parts. It is only when that motion presents the thing grossly and palpably to the sense as different from what it was, begin to mark the division. So his first problem with experiments is they're asking the wrong questions. They just ask, how much does something change? And they only mark something changing when they can see it changing. They don't look at why does it change or by what means does it change. It just says how much and at what point. So that's the wrong thing to be looking for. That's his first problem. What's his other problem? Well, for it generally happens that men make their trials carelessly, and as it were in play, slightly bearing experiments already known, and if the thing does not answer, growing weary and abandoning the attempt. Even if they apply themselves to experiments more seriously and earnestly and laboriously, still they spend their labor in working out some one experiment, as Gilbert with the magnet and the chemist with gold, a course of proceeding not less unskillful in the design than small in the attempt. For no one successfully investigates the nature of a thing and the thing itself. The inquiry must be enlarged so as to become more general. Okay, so his problem is, first, there are just some people who are lazy. They just do stuff that other people have already done, and if they don't succeed at it, they just give up. But even people who everyone else thinks are real scientists, like Gilbert, who discovers magnetism, which makes the compass, which means that navigation is possible, or the chemist with gold. Here Bacon seems to be just as impressed with the chemists discovering gold. We of course know that they failed. He says they're not lazy. They try hard and they're good at what they do, but they're too narrow. They're not asking what causes all this. They're not looking for general axioms and laws. They're just doing these one experiments, and they're small-minded. It's not a great criticism, and that's a very common problem people have with Bacon, that he's so against experiments, and it seems like it's not a great idea. All right, finally, his last problem is with the superstitious. He says these superstitious, these other philosophers, yet in this vanity some the moderns have with extreme levity indulged so far as to attempt to found a system of natural philosophy on the first chapter of Genesis, on the book of Job, and other parts of the sacred writings, seeking for the dead among the living, which also makes the inhibition and repression of it the more important, because from this unwholesome mixture of things human and divine arises not only a fantastic philosophy, but also a heretical religion. So he's like, yeah, some of these people that try to come up with science based on the Bible, and he's like, that is such a bad idea. It's bad science, it's bad religion, you're doing both wrongly. Just stop trying to do that. And you're worse than Aristotle, you're worse than empiricists. Stop mixing science and the Bible. Interesting to think about what Francis Bacon would say in our modern times. Okay, so finally, at the end of book 1, we get to his new system, his new instrument of science, based on experience. He says, namely, that the sciences stand where they did and remain almost in the same condition, receiving no noticeable increase, but on the contrary, thriving most on their first founder and then declining. Whereas in the mechanical arts, which are founded on nature and the light of experience, we see the contrary happen. For these, as long as they are popular, are continually thriving and growing, as having in them a breath of life, first rude, then convenient, afterwards adorned, and at all times advancing. So if science was like the mechanical arts, if science was like mechanics, it'd be so much better. The mechanical arts, inventions, whatever, this is based on experience. And they keep growing and improving and advancing, and people are getting better and better all the time. But science, which isn't based on experience, is not improving and advancing and getting better. It was best under Aristotle, and then it was worse after that. I don't think that's fair, but that's what he says. It's best under Aristotle, worst after that. Why is it worst? Because we didn't base it on experience. We only based it on what we thought. We need to come up with this new system based on experience, based on what we see in nature. And by the way, in terms of mechanical arts, he says the 3 things which have sort of changed everything are gunpowder, magnets through the compass, and printing. Gunpowder for warfare, the compass for navigation, printing through for intellectual arts. And you'll notice that actually he specifically says the Chinese are mistaken because they don't have an alphabet, which means printing is way harder for them. He specifically mentions that as an advantage that Europe has over China. Might be sort of historical interest for you guys. All right, so how do we guide our experience? Sorry, I keep messing that up. How do we guide our experience? We need to guide it through induction, right? Through reasoning from patterns, but not just any reasoning from patterns. For the reason which proceeds by simple enumeration is childish, its conclusions are precarious and exposed to peril from a contradictory instance. It generally decides on too small a number of facts, on those only which are at hand. So if you just go one after another, the last 5 have been like this, so the 6th is going to be like this. As soon as you get one that's not true, then your whole system goes to pot. And he says, also, you generally don't get enough stuff to conclude, and you're often only including from what you immediately see. He says, the induction which is to be available for the discovery and demonstration of sciences and arts must analyze nature by proper rejections and exclusions, and then after a sufficient number of negatives, come to a conclusion on the affirmative instances. So again, it's not, we're not going to go into his method again because it's silly, but he does have a point in which, like, we need a system with a lot of data where we're not just listing random observations. All right, finally, his last thing, Novum Organum, and I know we're running very short on time. Sorry for speaking so quickly. Is his defense of the pursuing science and knowledge over civic accomplishments. He says it's better to pursue science over government because for the benefits of discoveries may extend to the whole race of man, civil benefits only to particular places. The latter last not beyond a few ages, the former through all of time. So scientific discoveries benefit everyone and last all of time. Achievements in government benefit only a couple people and don't last too long. Sort of ironic considering how much of his life he spent trying to become powerful and influential, and that this was written after he was already forbidden from ever being politically powerful again. But, that's Bacon for you. And by the way, this is a monument in Russia to lab rats which have died in the service of science. Thought it's a great statue. Okay, conclusion, and then I will let you guys go. Sorry, I know I'm running short. So Novum Organum it's frustrating, but it's impressive. So first of all, his layout of his new method, it's so close to being good, but it's not quite there. He dismisses experiments, and he's really big on induction, but it's really not obvious what exactly we should be inducting from. Even if you read the rest of the book, he's not too clear himself. He has his example, which is not very good. So, but the problem of induction is going to come up again and again throughout all of our philosophy reading. So keep it in mind. It's impressive because his Bacon's insight into psychology and thinking are incredible. There are numerous parts of his writings which foreshadow psychological discoveries made only in the 20th century. Confirmation bias, just world fallacy, double-blind experiments. These are all things which are so important for the practice of science. And it's funny because he's so smart about it and he just doesn't have the proof for it. And it's the same thing with heat. He's so right on about what causes heat, but he doesn't have the proof for it. All right. Finally, so the most vital part of Novum Organum is the identification of science as a unique practice and the defense of the importance of it. And I know it seems so obvious now, but it wasn't obvious then. The idea that science is something based on experience rather than thought. There's a whole book about it that I could recommend to you guys if you want a sort of difficult read in English. Basically, during Bacon's time, science was not what we thought of it. And very smart, influential people didn't believe in the idea of science as experience, experience through knowledge. And we know this because Bacon, who was incredibly smart, wasn't even that big on experiments. Like, these are such basic things that you guys learn in elementary school that these brilliant men really didn't know. And that's why Bacon's so important. So he kickstarts the age of science in Britain, and he provides the impetus for the Royal Society, which is an organized scientific society eventually funded by the British government. Famous members include Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin. You know, it's really like a very important achievement, even if it was that alone. So eventually, you know, organized science spreads all around the world, including to China, which gives us the technologically based societies we have today. You know, here's a steam train. So everything in science, everything you take for granted, you can thank one Sir Francis Bacon for. All right. So that is the end of the lecture. Sorry, I ran a little bit over time. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Things to watch out for is that, as I mentioned last time, very, very soon, we're going to be launching a community page, probably on like Wednesday or so, based on it's on an American website called Reddit. And so it'll be a place to discuss philosophy. And the first thing I'm going to do is provide some discussion questions for you guys to answer, practice writing English, practice talking about philosophy. I'll help you guys along. And yeah, it should be really exciting. I'm really looking forward to creating a real community for us to discuss philosophy and discuss the philosophers we're talking about. Should be good. But anyways, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you for being patient with me as I ran overtime, and I'll see you next week.